Hi, I'm Hugh Steer. I write sci-fi and fantasy, short and long. I've got two-thirds of a fantasy trilogy, The Boiling Seas, a sci-fi novel, a kid's book, and a novella called The Singer, which I'm going to read the first couple of chapters for you now. So yeah, here we go. Excuse page turning sound effects. The soil was rough here and dry, but he'd spent the best part of 2 decades learning that, and the 2 decades before that learning how to deal with such things, kneeling in the dirt at his mother's side as she had shown him how to coax life from the earth, just as her father had shown her and his mother had shown him, and on, or so he had been told, though any genuine memory of those ancient generations was long lost, surviving only in a few fragments of half-remembered story. His family worked the earth and were rewarded. That was how it was. That was how it had always been. He stood up from the earth, wincing at the pain in his back, an ever-present irritation these days. He leaned on his staff a little and looked out across the field. The soil was rough and dry, but the first tiny shoots of green were just beginning to emerge. It hadn't rained in a week, but he'd gone out every day and done what his mother had taught him, and the crop had begun, little by little, to thrive. The other fields were the same. He had 4 of them now, and smiled proudly at the thought of them. They weren't the best ground for farming, but he made them work, though they'd been filled with rocks, though the east field was half a hillside, making ploughing furrows a minor nightmare every year. He had an orchard now, too, just a small one, but the spindly saplings of the apple trees bore leaves of healthy green. Little by little, the sweat and blood he had poured into the earth was being paid back in kind. The soil was demanding, but if treated well, it always paid its debts. His back twinged again as he set off down the field, back to his house, and he winced with it. He had a liniment for the pain, but he was running low. He'd have to visit Mary in the village and get some more. It was no hardship. He smiled at the thought of seeing her, as much as he disliked the thought of visiting the village doctor. But these were his fields. This was his life. Until he had a child or two running laughing round the orchard, he had to keep himself oiled and free of rust. That'll be the day, he thought. The day when he could teach his own children what his mother had taught him, so that one day, when he was in the ground himself, one of them would take the 4 fields and the orchard and the little farmhouse, and they would keep them and farm them and raise a family of their own. But not the eldest. That wasn't their lot, that wasn't his family's way. He had been the firstborn and had his mother, as had her father and his mother and her mother. The first did not stay and tend what had already been tamed. The first went forth into the wilds and found dry soil and a harsh earth of their own. They built there and poured their life into the earth and received life in return. That was what he had done 2 decades before, leaving the old farm and the forest clearing in the hands of his elderly mother and his 3 younger sisters. He'd taken the clothes on his back, the staff in his hand, a little of the bounty of the earth to keep him fed and watered, and a leather purse his mother had pressed into his hand, cracked and stained with age. He had gone forth into the world and wandered for a long time, until he found the village of Quern, and after an evening's conversation in the local inn, had learned that old man Hodges was selling the old wheat field at the foot of the cliff, and the wooden shack besides, and would he be interested? And the farmer had smiled, and the next morning had given old man Hodges half the shining gold in his mother's purse, and the first of the 4 fields had become his. 20 years later, old man Hodges was long in the ground, but the farmer was still here, and was as much a fixture of Quern as he had ever been. He made to close the wheatfield's gate behind him, but paused, glancing back at the cliff that loomed above it, where a stand of trees stood proudly against the reddening sky. It was the edge of the village, a natural boundary to mark the end of the sprawling fields and farmsteads that surrounded the little cluster of houses at the centre, the only concentration of people large enough to actually merit the Welcome to Quern sign. He had made his home on the very boundary of civilization, and it suited him well. He wouldn't describe himself as a solitary man, but he was perfectly happy to go weeks at a time without human conversation. He pursed his lips and whistled. A nose and a set of whiskers suddenly protruded from the hedgerow, followed by a set of wide, inquisitive eyes. "Come on, you," the farmer said with a smile. "Home." With a great crashing of branches, the dog burst from the hedge in a tangle of black and white limbs and a furiously thumping tail. Somehow she sorted her legs out while already in motion, trotting happily down the field to the farmer's side. He reached down and scratched her behind the ears, rewarded with his contented growl. The farmer closed the gate behind them, let the dog lead the way down the light winding path towards the village and towards their home. The dog was curled up in front of the fire, crackling gently in the grate. The farmer had cut down an old ash tree at the edge of the east field the year before. It had the rot. He'd not caught it in time. The necessity had saddened him, but he'd sawn it up and carried every piece home to his woodpile, where it had spent a year drying. Now it was finally ready to burn, and it burned well. All things must return to the earth in time, he thought to himself, leaning back in his chair, a chair he carved from the very same wood, piece by piece. But they don't have to be buried straight away. The farmhouse was small, but it was his, and he laid every brick himself. The wooden shack that old man Hodges had sold him was still there, next to the back door, but he used it as a tool shed now. It had been old and draughty when he first bought the land, and was still old and draughty now, though it would have long since fallen down if he hadn't made sure to nail it back together once in a while. His mother Gold had kept him fed and watered, while he'd slowly coaxed the old wheat field back to life, learning what the dry soil needed, how to sate its hunger. It had taken almost a year before he was happy enough with the earth to sow his first seeds. He'd figured he might as well use the time to make somewhere a bit more pleasant to live in. So he talked to Carter, who was, confusingly, the local mason, and enlisted the help of several of the other farmers in the village, who were more than happy to help a new fellow set up his life, in return for future favours and some good drink. They dug foundations, laid stones and bricks, hoisted great beams into place, and by the year's end the farmer had 4 rooms to call his own and a roof of slate besides. As his farm had grown, so had the house, slowly, but enough to go from sufficient to comfortable. Now he had a cold cellar, and a proper pantry, and even a shelf of old and battered books. It was as much as any man could hope for. 4 fields, an orchard, and a home of my own. Quern had several other farms already, all family that had been running for at least a couple of generations. But the field at the foot of the cliff and the other fields he'd gradually accumulated had been of poor soil. Farmers had tried and failed, one after another, to make them thrive. That was how he got them all at such knockdown prices, after all. Many had tried, and many had given the effort up as a bad job. But he had been patient, and he had used the skills his mother had spent 20 years teaching him, and slowly but surely he had brought life to the lifeless. People of Quern had been dismissive at first. They thought him just another opportunist, just another dreamer, at least when his back had been turned. But over the course of 20-odd more years, their disrespect had become amazement, as his crops had begun to flourish, as his harvests had grown. And they never really talked about it, though they never went so far as to call him special. It was him the other farmers turned to, when they thought they saw signs of wheat rot or blight, or if a tree seemed to be growing twisted or wrong. And usually they were right to. He knew plants. He was happy to share that knowledge. His name was one to conjure with in Quern now. He was part of the village. Wouldn't have it any other way, he thought to himself with a smile. It was late. He'd eaten, and the embers of the fire would keep the house nice and warm until the dawn. He stood, stretching and wincing as his back thrummed again in protest, opened the back door for the dog to nip out to do her business. He waited there, the night's chill doing battle at the threshold with the warmth of the fire within, until the dog trotted back inside and he closed the door, deciding the battle on the combatant's behalf. He patted the dog good night, climbed up the narrow wooden stairs to bed. He lay there, banishing the thoughts of all the things he needed to get done in the morning, and listened to the song of the wind and the fields until sleep took him. That's the start, anyway, if you'd like to read more.